Okay, so you probably have to click, you have to continue to be recorded. And we put these up on the YouTube site that Jason Hugh has created. So, let me just introduce a couple of the new people here. You want to say a few things, Hamish? You are an OBE, Order of the British Empire. I've worked overseas, Special Forces. I have worked with you for a while. You want to say anything?
I personally am a civilian. I've been involved in various programs overseas to do with trying to develop social safety, security and well-being, in particular countering extremism by working at grassroots with building block materials. So I have a general interest. Lowell was involved in a couple of programs with us, and really I'm just here to listen and perhaps add one or two things that may be of interest at some stage.
Well, good. And we have a new person here, Terry Waite. Hello.
Hello there.
You want to just introduce yourself? Most people may know you, but some may not.
Well, my name is Terry Waite. I'm speaking from the county of Suffolk in England, and from our house there, which was built in about 1400. So it's about time we redecorated. I'm a hostage negotiator in the past and a former hostage. Served for 5 years in solitary confinement in the Middle East, and latterly founded an organization called Hostage International, which gives support to hostage families and returning hostages in all sorts of ways. And it's now set up in the States as well. There's Hostage USA. We have a branch there, another branch in Italy, and various ones around the world. My role simply now, I moved from an executive role. I'm simply the founder and president.
Thank you, thank you. And
could our new friend Anchor, Terry, and Richard send me your email address so I can put you on the mailing list?
Yeah, sure.
Please.
Right. With other person we may want to introduce is Loot. They're in Amsterdam. Loot has provided some very interesting work on systems in education academia to people coming into college. And you're coming out with a book, I think.
Yes. Actually, the proofs are done. So it will be in February or something like that. And the title is Evolutionary Dynamics of Discursive Knowledge, with the subtitle Communication Theoretical Perspectives on an Empirical Philosophy of Science. So it's very ambitious, and I hope we are just discussing whether it can be done open access. In that case, would be much easier. That would be fantastic. Yes. So you just have to wait a bit, and then it will be available. My thesis in it is that in the interaction of expectations, we shape a double contingency, and the double contingency was defined by Tucker Parsons as the expectation of ego that Alter, the other, entertains expectations as one expects oneself, and that this is the micro operation of the social system, because it cannot be grounded in an individual agent like the Homo economicus or most of the actor-oriented sociology. This is the micro operation of an interactive communication system, which is reflexive about its shaping. And that can lead to knowledge. Okay, that's enough, I think, isn't it? No?
Yes, thank you. And Bob Kinsley, just to introduce yourself a little bit, you've worked with the federal government, have put out, I think, one of the most important government handbooks on what is governing government. You want to say a little bit about yourself?
Oh, hi. I have the disadvantage of a law degree. Been involved going to assorted meetings, etc., on cybernetics for 20, 30 years. Worked for the federal government for my 30 years in a variety of different places, and am very concerned about the design of government. If we want to change the way society works, we have to be very thoughtful in terms of unintended consequences and so forth and so on. I was lucky enough to run into Stuart Umpleby, and in 2015, I did a presentation on the design of government at GW, which has been edited down to 22 minutes and is on YouTube, which we, although it's a thin gruel from a cybernetic standpoint, you might find it interesting. We could present it sometime. That's
That would
about
be
it.
an interesting presentation.
And I don't have to talk anymore because it's all right there in the video.
Good. And we have a new person here, Glenn. You want to say a little bit about your, 50 years in the government on language and culture and the CIA and everything else?
No, that's all past. I'll let it stand as it is. Thank you.
Okay. That's good. Let's just wait a couple more minutes while other people are tuning in. And then we'll go to my presentation on the fog of war and fog of peace. And how do we penetrate that? And how does systems thinking possibly allow us to penetrate the fog of war and the fog of peace? We have two people on the audio links. One is Jerry Chandler. He's up in Minnesota. Hello, Jerry.
Good morning all. How you doing?
Jerry is a biochemist from the National Institutes of Health. He's been working for, 20 years now on why the world of physics and the world of power and our symbolic systems don't work in the complexity once you go to biochemistry. You want to say anything else, Jerry, about what your beautiful world thinking is about?
Well, just a couple personal notes. We got a nice 4 inches of fresh snow last night, and the world looks pretty clean up here today. And the other point, I guess, is my favorite bald eagle named Abe is sitting on a muskrat house out in front on the Mississippi, and he seems to be enjoying his fishing opportunity this morning. Other than that, I'm good. All's good here.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you.
And I do have y'all on the iPhone Zoom app this morning, and your faces are coming in clear.
Fantastic. And the other person who's listening in is Valerie Lamont, who worked with Heinz von Forster at the Biological Computer Laboratories in Champaign, Urbana. Worked a lot with the Plato early learning systems, and is just listening in. And we appreciate your attendance there, Valerie.
Glad to be here, and a lay person's listening in is what I'm doing here.
Yay, Valerie.
Okay. Any questions about my presentation and what I sent out before I start in? Okay, let me just start in. The title is The Fog of War and the Fog of Peace. Fog of war, of course, comes from Karl von Clausewitz, who never said that exactly. All he said was, fog is a metaphor for the ambiguity of war. How do we get through the ambiguity of war? And The Fog of Peace is the title of a book by John Domenico Pico, hostage negotiator that got Terry Waite out of the Middle East. I gave him that title when he was working with his co-author, psychologist. And so the topic is the fog of war and the fog of peace. and how do we penetrate? And what I'm going to do is just give you a couple stories as crayons to paint, and then I'll give you a little coloring diagram to fill in, and then I'll go through. So what I like to do is give the stories, give this diagram, and after each slide, any questions. Gregory, today is, of course, Veterans Day or Remembrance Day in the Middle East. 11/11/11 is when the war stops. You can't really understand Veterans Day or Remembrance Day unless you drive along the coast of Scotland. The west coast of Scotland, each small town, Arran, Mallaig, Oban, Ullapool, has memorials to their World War I dead. And you really don't get a sense of the amazing tragedy here in the United States and the heavy cloud that that left. What was important about that experience, I think, is embodied in one quick story, is that during World War I, regiments were put together based on where they came from, like all the train conductors and engineers were put into one little company or regiment. In one day in World War II, every train engineer in Glasgow was dead. Everyone, in one day, because they're all put there together. Now, I experienced something in Scotland when I was on my honeymoon, when I married a Scottish lass. We were going over to Plockton, over to Isle of Skye, and there was a gentleman in a tweed coat on a rural highway hitchhiking. So I picked him up. I'm a big guy. I don't mind those things. My wife was a bit concerned. He gets in, and all of a sudden you could smell the alcohol. And he, you know, we started talking. I said, well, were you celebrating today? He says, no. My daughter married today. Oh, were you at the wedding? No, I did not go. I would not go. Well, I thought that was curious. And he says, I fought in World War II. Look in your rearview mirror. See my right eye? That was blasted away by a German. My daughter married a German today. I could not go to her wedding. I was like, okay, wow, that's important. How do you get through the fog of war? Gregory Bateson, on this day, Remembrance Day in 1944, wrote something that penetrated the fog of the coming wars. He wrote one sentence. He says, from the local natives, and he was referring to the British India in the Middle East, from the local natives will come a new form of warfare where the local natives use culture as a weapon against the white man. What we have today is a cultural wars more powerful than any bombs, etc., that we have in our military world. Out of the Dio Bande from the 1880s, they developed two seeds, a good seed and a bad seed. The bad seed still feeds Afghanistan today as the intellectual center for terrorism. How to get rid of the British back in the 1880s went to the bombings, etc. The good seed was Gandhi and the way he used culture, the spinning wheels, the salt marches, etc., to gain the liberation. What was interesting is that was given to Wild Bill Donovan, who ultimately set up the CIA, but that was ignored because what happened a year later was the nuclear bomb of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. 5 days later, Bateson wrote another 5-page treatise saying, in my understanding of how cultures interact, you have a new weapon that will allow for our thinking, our social thinking, to be asymmetric, and we will kill ourselves. We'll kill the planet. So his letter became the justification when they laid down the Office of Strategic Services and created the CIA because he said you have to know what your opponent does and your opponent has to know what you do in order to allow it from spinning out of control. So that was kind of an interesting thing. The third point was his daughter, Mary Catherine Bateson. I was with her at a cybernetics conference, the 50th year of the conference of the Cybernetic Society in America. And I said, how could this ragtag bunch of Americans in the 1770s overpower the most powerful economic, military, and political force of the world at that time? And he said, that's simple. And I hate it when a woman tells me it's simple, which means I'm stupid. And she says, it was the committees of correspondence. I said, committees of correspondence? Yeah, they were formed after the Stamp Act, where every piece of paper, every subscription had to be overseen by an agent of the king. We learned how to tar and feather these agents like no one had ever done before. But what was created was a network so sophisticated that General Howe said the average woman in the kitchen knows more about where my troops are than I do, because they created a network throughout the whole country. So all of a sudden I said, oh my God, you can use information and culture to change and overpower traditional power. That was very powerful, I thought. So that's why I've spent 7 years understanding how Americans fought in the 1770s that allowed us to create a type of government we have. I'm just going to give you one story. This is when I was in the international trade business, fast growing, Inc. magazine write-up, etc. And the vice chairman, Charles E. Allen, had graduated towards the end of World War II. He went to the State Department. His first job was to take German SS industrialists, those who had the tank tread factories, etc., and was to recreate the German economy under the Marshall Plan. So he had these people, they met in Washington, and then they took a train ride to Chicago, where the industrial base, of course, was. Partway through that train ride from Washington to Chicago, this Prussian general marches in and says, you are tricking us. I am an engineer. I know what you're doing, and marches out. Then as you go from the 14-hour train ride, you end up the lower part of Lake Michigan. That's where all the industrial open hearth furnaces were for steel and iron. And at that time, being open hearth, it literally looked like you're in Hades, and would go for miles and miles. This general marches in and says, I know you're tricking us. You cannot, you're going around in circles. There's no way you can have this many plants, iron plants. And Charles Allen takes out his compass, shows that they're going towards the west. All of a sudden, this general, proud Prussian general, sits down, puts his hands over her face and cries. Charles Allen said, what's up? The Prussian general said, in our textbook that I grew up, that every child in Germany grew up with, we had a map of Germany on one page. We had a map of America on the other page. They were the same size. We fight above our weight. Of course we can take down America. That one image helped propel a war machine. And so what I'm going to be talking about today is that consciousness that goes beyond our everyday command and control consciousness, particularly in the military. And it's about the image. So let me go to my one slide and see if we can get that up. Okay. Come on there. All right. 1 second. My pointer is not pointing very well. There we go. Can you see that?
No, no, we don't
No,
have
not yet. No.
No? Okay.
just have the portraits.
Okay, let me try to get back there.
You, oh yes, we saw something.
There we are.
There it is.
Come up? Is it up or not?
Yeah,
Yes, it
Yes.
is.
Thank you.
Okay. So here, what I want to do is give you the crayons to look at Veterans Day in terms of how it is. And the slides will layer on top of this model. This is a cybernetic tool of natural history that I've been working on since working with Gregory Bateson. And people like Judith Rosen and Richard Rosen talk about the model and the environment and the interaction there. What a natural history of humans is not just the model of the animal and the environment. We are the most unnatural of natural animals because we have two environments. We have the physical environment, the environment around us, and our symbolic and institutional environment. And you can't penetrate that just by looking at the everyday command and control consciousness that a culture or society has. And what you're looking at is a levels of model, paradigm, logic of the system of systems that supports our consciousness and our perceptual field. We observe things through the model of our world. And when we talk about the nation state, when we talk about various wars and how they're fought, it is all within a larger, what I call a snail diagram. We bring the past with us. Now, I'm a cultural anthropologist, and I use this sort of model by looking at reconstructing the thinking patterns of a people like the American Revolution. And on one side, you have the supply chain of ideas that come into a time frame. You look at all the diaries and letters and the ways that they look at, and then you look at the natural history consequence of that pattern. And this on the right is an adaptation of Richard Knowles' work in safety, where the model is the command and control center. And that's the way we see the world. We walk around. We don't need to be thinking about our thinking, but we just think and see. And the way you map it, the way you do it graphically, is looking at the intention or agenda, the issues as they're perceived problems, and the work protocols. The way we are right now in America and the world, we are in the model, and the logic and paradigm are out of sync with the environment that we're working. And you cannot create a change of the system unless you look at all three levels. The paradigm loop is a strange loop, and that's a term from Hofstadter in his book is I Am a Strange Loop. This is the observer, etc., in a world, and it's that image of that German-Prussian officer that looked at two maps and they shrank down the size of America. He thought, because he could calculate as an engineer, that they would be in California when he marched in the first time to Charles E. Allen. And so he was working within a model and a paradigm that had been programmed. The logic of that culture of how we use power is part of our Western civilization and arises out of the Treaty of Westphalia, which we'll hopefully get to. But each one of these levels has a triangle. Like any engineer, you need 3 points to find a center. And this is how I go through in mapping a culture. So you look at learning, the principles and standards, and the super context or the structure, the institutions that you have. Now, if you're in a command and control thing, you try to use propaganda, or as Trump does, etc., his changing of that strange loop image. But there's another way of approaching it that the Americans used in their second revolution, beyond the revolution against oppression of the British, the revolution of the mind of how do you deal with tyranny. And that's the logic of living systems. It's an ontology. And you ask the questions, how does a system process information? What is its identity and its relationship structures? So as you look at various revolutions, half revolutions, wars, and rumors of wars, it comes from the model level upwards to the strange loop image to try to manipulate it. The living system, the self-organization system that is in living systems is that logic, that ontology. So just think about that as I go through my presentation. Any questions so far?
Yeah, I think I would like to raise a question. So you distinguish between the natural environment and the, let's say, the mental environment, yeah, or
Yes.
the cultural environment, and then you go back and forth between natural history and you all including the word system. Is that not a bit confusing? Shouldn't we keep apart those two dynamics?
If you look at don't have the slide up, but the way a horse's hoof has evolved over time, which is one of the most amazing engineering feats, etc. The interaction with the environment, the predator-prey relationship, etc., all allowed a evolution to a amazing structure, morphology. The intelligence of a horse is not in its brain, it's in its structure, in its morphology. In a human thing, we have a double loop of our symbolic system, our institutions, our environment around us that we have created. And I use it a little later in the presentation, the difference between beavers that change their environment, allow the adaptation of the environment. So as an example, in England, they're importing Canadian beavers to control floods because they know more about how to control a flood than the engineers do. They're able to modify their environment, birds are able to build nests, etc. But it's that interaction with the environment that's pretty raw. What we're doing is a double side that allows our environment of our institutions, our paradigms, to work our models, to direct our models, and the larger logic of the living system is around it. What happens is when the logic and the paradigm are out of sync with the environment, the culture collapses or is overcome by its own internal lack of structure. Does that answer it, Luke?
Yes, it does.
Good. Okay. So here's a question from an art. This was an article by Gregory Bateson when he was asked and gave a presentation. What's the most significant events of the 20th century? He says there are only two major events. One of them is the Treaty of Versailles, and the second one is the beginning of cybernetics. Now, for those, I think in Europe probably understand the Hall of Mirrors in the Treaty of Versailles, where the concepts of power of the British and the French overcame this doughboy President Woodrow Wilson and his idea of the 14 points of a just peace. Because what the French and others did was ultimately put the reparations on Germany. In 1989 would have been the last payment by Germany from 1919 of their reparations. It would have kept them on the level of making cuckoo clocks and sausage and not developing, which was their purpose, of course. It made World War II almost inevitable. This was a human-centric in the historical repetitive circuits or cycles that move through time. So what was the lesson here? The lesson was addressing problems in rational ways, direct and results-oriented, sometimes ensures its long-term failure. I was down in Mexico in '71 with Heinz von Forster. I had just graduated from Vanderbilt, honors in philosophy. I did a thesis on play and structures that form a learning cycle. And he read my thesis, says, how can they give a degree to something like this? It doesn't have one mathematical formula. So he says, you're not going to become an engineer. I knew that before. But he says, well, let me tell you what I just completed at University of Illinois. I have a book called The Dream That Is More Than a Dream. And it's about how Germany created the image in the population of the motherland, of the role of women, of the Aryan race, etc. The use of film in Nuremberg, etc. When he gave that to me, he says, this is a problem you could probably chew on. And I've been doing that for 45 years. How do you get that image level? But what affected me was when he handed it to me, his hands were shaking. He had been in the belly of the beast in Germany as a Jew, as an engineer, and he understood the horror. And that's why cybernetics was a way of thinking to get us out of this rational, control, purpose-oriented ideas and sciences that led us to the justification of wars. The other aspect was the beginning of cybernetics. And that's what I want to talk about. It's system-centric that needs to unravel images, identities, and relationships that create a fated structure. Those three levels. I'm conscious at the model level, but I'm not conscious of the other levels. So the lesson is that there are two kinds of systems, ones that rely on feedback and stabilities, and others that tend to escalate and create runaway trends. If you look at what's happening in America, you can see an unhealthy system. Any questions on that? Okay. So what I'm talking about is a natural history of the human estate, how you change system vectors that result in wars and rumors of war. So how do we penetrate the fogs of war and peace? So the question that I'm asking here is, can cybernetic tools of feedback, feed forward, regulation, self-organization, mapping of the consequences of the organization of our images and symbolic cultural systems be part of a science of living systems and provide a practical means of navigating complexity? We are all prisoners of our own construction. Can cybernetics discern the differences and consequences in the design of our natural and unnatural constructed environments? So what we started our Club of Remy talking about is social change. And what we're looking for are the forks in the road, the bifurcation that marks the place of emergence, of a new line of development that begins to branch off. This comes from William Thompson, who died over the past weekend, biologist, cultural critic, a really good thinker. Questions? Why do I say natural history may be a tool to prevent the fog of war or penetrate the fog of war and peace? If you look at this, the breadcrumbs left by the founders of systems and cybernetics, which creates the information technology, the drones, the robots, the servo mechanisms, etc., that we war with, that was not the main purpose of these founders. And what are some of the last words of the founders? One is from Heinz von Forster in a piece called Heaven and Earth Have No Name. He says, what do we need are transformations of observations on natural and cultural history. Wittgenstein says, what we're supplying are really remarks on the natural history of man. Bateson said, a natural history is an ecology of minds, a critique of concepts like power, linear, rational thought, and tyranny. And the other founders gave us a way of thinking about this. Heinz von Forster, the logic of the world is the logic of the descriptions of the world. Now remember, the dream that was more than a dream, he tried to document the images used in Nazi Germany to propel a people to be living next to a crematorium, and said, this is really great fertilizer we're creating. And so Ashby said, every good regulator of a system must be a model of that system. It must be more complex. Everyday consciousness, command and control consciousness, does not allow us to look at the 360 system around us. And Kenneth Boulding, in his book, The Image, Knowledge in Society and Life, said, the future is a science of the image. So that's where the people have left off to where do we need to be going? So this may be addressing Luke's question. Here's on the left is a most detailed model of a human cell to date. They use all sorts of X-rays, nuclear magnetic resonance, to look at the complexity of a single cell, mitochondria, membranes, all that type of stuff. Now compare that to the evolution of the city-states into the nation-states. Now, what's interesting about this place is this became the model for the design of Disney World by Walt Disney, this town. So it's a great fantasy world, but may not have the complexity that we need to deal with, or that higher level of the logic beyond our models that we see the world through. So this gets to Luke's question. The natural history of the human estate describes a resonant space for the emergence of behavior between the organization's model and the logic of the environment. So it's a dual level between our physical environment, between our symbolic environment. Human thinking must be developed. Vanderveer Bush wrote an article, As We May Think, about the future of information technology when we're still at war in 1945 with the Japanese, just won the European front, where he talked about information technology and its potential. What I would like to rename it is, As We May Think, So Unfolds Destiny. And so the way we think is extremely important. So here's, I mentioned before, beavers changing the environment. It's organism plus environment. Bateson said the unit of evolution is organism plus environment. He didn't say this other thing is, the unit of evolution for humans is the organization of the mind and the entire social system, as well as the physical environment. So how do we get a thinking science that deals with the complexity, not only of a single cell, but of whole human systems. Here, as you know, the normal natural history, you go into a museum, you see your T-Rex, you see your elephants, etc. You see the animals. But Margaret Mead and others all spent their lives at the New York Natural History Museum, trying to get ideas about the human culture, besides looking at it as like a zoo animals. And what's important is that second point, that changes in internal states insofar as they pertain to what the organisms do. When a mollusk with its protective shell evolves into a octopus or squid with no protective shell, the evolutionary trajectory and vector in terms of intelligence, in terms of camouflage capacity, speed, etc., goes up. So we're looking at increases of complexity over evolution. We don't necessarily see that in human society with our wars and rumors of wars forever. And this is the third point there, is the morphology of the organism is the evolutionary intelligence from previous environmental interactions. We have this human hubris thinking that our 3 to 5 pound brain is the center of intelligence. No, it is in the morphology of the animal that the intelligence is embodied. Otherwise, our COVID-19, which is only a strip of RNA, a messenger, protein, and a lipid fat, which is not even a living system classified, is able to outsmart our smarts because it has evolutionary intelligence behind it. So what's happening over in Denmark with the mink and the transmission between and the modification of the spikes of the COVID is an example of the evolutionary intelligence. How do we get that evolutionary intelligence to the human development? And so if you go to the right-hand side, we are symbolic beavers with a multi-level environment. And the second point down there is we have 3 levels. And this comes out of an article from 1887 of Franz Boas, who was the German anthropologist that created American anthropology of Ruth Benedict, Margaret Mead, and influenced Bateson. And he was complaining about this development of a unique type of science out of logical positivism that tried to reconstruct the French Revolution of absolute positivism. And he says, we need 2 sciences. You need the one, the analytic one, etc., that we have today, but it takes things apart. What he was saying is you need a interaction 3-level descriptive things. He talked about the articles is interestingly labeled the study of geography. But what he says is the geographical landscape of the physical givens need to be mapped. The anthropographic landscape of institutions, rituals, etc. needs to be understood. And then the cosmological or the symbolic structures. And how does it work on a truth function in terms of how that society evolves or collapses? So what we're looking at is requiring an unwinding of the emergent space of consciousness. And that's what I do as a cognitive archaeologist, where you're looking at how do you go from today backwards and backwards forwards. And the best ways of looking at systems is looking at forms of warfare. That the OODA loop of Colonel Boyd of observation, orientation, decision, action, where he used it for the high interaction of aerial combat. What we're saying here is there is a step even before that, the orientation. We call it proception before preception. So we're trying to get that proception of the paradigm and logic. Questions? Where do I come from? And the landscape today that we have talked a lot about. Jason and others are obviously concerned about the Black Lives Matter, the riots in the street coming from China and the oppression of the Chinese government. And where I come from is the History of Consciousness program at the University of California at Santa Cruz. This was a hotbed that spawned a lot of what we have today. There were two components, or two groups, basically, there at the History of Consciousness. One is we had people like Huey Newton, Black Panther, with Bobby Steele out of Merrill College in Oakland. They created the children's feeding programs, trying to create the Black Panther Nation. He was in prison several times, ultimately assassinated. We had Angela Davis. We have people like Donna Haraway, who deals with cyber feminism. Out of that came the Black historical studies, the Chicana sort of studies, lesbian and feminism studies, women's studies. The first program in women's studies was at University of California, Santa Cruz, came out of this program. So we spawned all these people out there that were dealing with an idea of the people's history. Howard Zinn, who was not there, but influenced us. That's pretty radical. So this was about the how do you get outside the ruling class. There was a lot of thinking about Marxism. Huey Newton, of course, went over to China. That was one part that I was not interested in. The other part was with Gregory Bateson, Norman O. Brown, Page Smith, etc., dealing with the formation of our consciousness, the history of our consciousness. And so what we were looking at is we had people like Barry Katz, who's down at the California Art Institute, Design Institute, doing design thinking. We have Stephen Nachmanovich, who was in my class also, that dealt with music. And what I try to deal with is how do you do social change. So you realize where I'm coming from, and where we are now is partially as a result of this History of Consciousness program, which is now highly regulated because obviously it became highly controversial there. So so let's get down to the nation state and the principle of territorial sovereignty. And so think about it in terms of the levels of that German general going to Chicago and the push of history at 3 levels. It's set in a series of solutions that created the greater world, basically. It embodied certain meta models of Western consciousness that would be at the logic level. Gregory Bateson talked about how can a society that starts with the Judaic, Christian, Islamic creation narrative, in the beginning was the Word was God, the Word was power, that's Matthew and Paul. That idea of power being extracted away from the world, that was our majesty. That has given us the power of changing the world. But it also means we're divorced from the larger environment, which natural history then connects us back to. So you look at how the Treaty of Westphalia of 1648 was designed to stop the religious wars where 2/3 of the German population was killed by the other 2/3. This was part of the world we're in now when you have new mediums, like, and there was the printing press, of course. They helped solve that problem. The way they solved it was giving identity, nation, to the king. And so you're Catholic or you're whatever the particular denomination is, identity was taken care of. There was no quibbling. And you had the Inquisition to make sure people were in line. That worked great until technology collapsed time and space, and everyone was up against the borders. And of course, we know what happened in the 20th century as a result of that sort of Treaty of Westphalia. But in the interim was fascinating because all of a sudden we're not supposed to kill one another's neighbor. So what we have is the greatest expansion on the right-hand side, you'll see, of colonialism. By 1914, I guess it was, 80+% of the world was under colonial control, 80-odd%. So what it did was push the kings, etc., to conquering other peoples around the world and colonizing them. When you look at the counter to a Treaty of Versailles, you can look at something like the Atlantic Charter, a one-page document that was given by Franklin Delano Roosevelt to Winston Churchill. This was off the coast of Canada. It says, if you want us, America, to come into the war, not just supply you goods, you have to sign this document. This was a subversive document. What it did is say, every colony, every group shall have self-determination. I grew up in the time when all Africa was throwing off its colonial masters, etc. The problem is, they then went back to becoming even better colonial masters with black faces, because they were half revolutions, weren't whole revolutions that looked at the larger context. So you changed the figures, but you didn't change the function, etc. So the counter design of the Atlantic Charter was embodied because of what happened at the Treaty of Versailles to counter this colonial world of 1914, where 80-odd% of the world's under colonial control. We continued our revolution in America. Just want to deal with 3 examples of grounding a truth function. And Bateson on the left, he says, and I never really truly understood Bateson until I saw a film clip where he says, I live in a world different than you. I live in a world of relationships, not things. Think about images, that level, the ontology of a living system, and the architecture there. So in his, we just talked about the Treaty of Versailles and the cybernetic movement as a counter. A person that we have with us here taught me a lot about meta-perception, Hamish McDonald. I can say this, Hamish may want to say it, I don't know, but the way Hamish was trained, that I understand, was that he was trained by the Japanese ninja to see, not what's there. He was an artist. They allowed him to paint what he saw, but until he could paint where exactly the heron would light on the stream before the heron would light on the stream, because he knew the system behind the everyday consciousness. He went off to the Amazonia, and the warrior learns how to climb a tree to see the context, the larger context wherein he works. So you can go off to the Andes and see these amazing rock formations that can only be seen by God because they're so big, of birds and animals, etc., because they were dealing with the wholeness of the system. And then, as I understand it, and I can be stand granted, is looking at the Inuits' salmon eye, where you look below the ocean and the currents and the trends and the movements of things. That is a warrior. That is a person who sees beyond what is given. The last one is a person, John Domenico Pico. We're trying to put together a documentary or a film about, he wrote a book called Man Without a Gun. He helped stop the Iran-Iraq war in a week or so, help free some hostages, because the way he thought. He was born in a Alps village that had its unique language that went across the Alps but was not Italian. where he lived was on the border of Italy, Austria, and Yugoslavia. It's said that his grandmother's feet is buried in one country and her head in another. I mean, it's that confluence of identities allowed him to see things beyond the conflict of the Iran-Iraq war and help leverage peace. So here's examples of people who are able to look at the world differently. So here's my last slide. The hypothesis I'm presenting is that natural history, a cybernetic history of history, provides tools to critique and change the system. So instead of the problem of the model and the way we are now, and I've seen this in Washington time and again, in Afghanistan, elsewhere, is they have a certain model of how to work, looking at the issues, looking at the tools sets they have, looking at the work protocols, that first level of the model. But they're not able to really look beyond that. And so they are prisoners of their own thinking, arising from the Treaty of Versailles, arising from the nation-state structure. So that snail model, we are bringing things with, how do we get that snail model in its layers? And anthropology is interesting. It used to be plunder. You just go in, you get King Tut's coffin, and you take it away. Archaeology now is more sophisticated. It's called delayering. You look at all the layers and interact with the layers of how that culture went from nothing to create a stone arrowhead to copper to bronze. And you look at the interaction of the layers, because at each level, there is an interaction of the past and the future. And you can then look at the vector of those people through that. It's a delayering. What is the meta truth function? And that's where I think we can really make some traction in looking at the paradigm and logic levels that reveal organizing principles, their cultural paradigms of our common consciousness through which we experience. So introducing the fourth dimension of time, the structuring organization guides the emergence of governing and perceptions over time. A history of patterns, not things and events. So we look at the architectural constraints of the paradigm of the logic, and given those frameworks, we can construct with available models how that system will repeat. So that image of America and Germany, the same size, or reveal the blind spots in that resonant space where distinct patterns emerge, which can be seen as revolutions or evolutions. That concludes my presentation. Questions?
Thank you so much.
If I may, I have an immediate question. The fourth dimension of time. I'm curious what that stands for, including the fact that implies there are 3 other dimensions before it. So what are you trying to say with that, Lowell?
3 things, actually. The fourth dimension relates to the 3 dimensions of space: up, down, left, right, forward, back.
Okay, so it's not...
The brain of a rat and the human brain, in order to navigate, has a hexagonal structure and has...
Then I got it. I get it.
It allows us to navigate. What humans add to that is time and our understanding our mortality and the development and changing that development, not through evolution, but through humanly constructed evolutionary pathways.
So you're using the metaphor of space to give meaning to the idea of time.
Well, the space is what we see. It has all our things around us we bump into in the night. But looking at time and history, that natural history of development. That's my second point. Development and the growth vectors. We need to be changing our growth vectors, because our growth vectors drive us to the wars and rumors of wars forever and ever, as the Bible said. Our structures of that little snail moving along with us in our common consciousness. Does that answer it, Jimmy?
Yes.
Okay.
Can I then follow up on my question?
Please.
Yes, because I think as long as you keep the unit of analysis, the individual consciousness, you keep in an environment which is embodied, and then natural history and genesis and morphogenesis, the arrow of time is followed in the build-up. And you miss the point that in the interaction, what you call humans, yeah, and then you use the plural, and you usually use the singular when you talk about observers or interpreters or people who look.
Yes.
As soon as you introduce that dimension of the intercultural, the exchange of expectations, which can be theories and can build theories and reverse the arrow of time, not only as the beavers do, but we can build enormous bridges and tunnels and whatever. We can reconstruct the environment, not individually, but on the basis of what we develop in the interaction among us. And that interaction among us is no longer constrained by history. It's no longer embodied. And that's the advantage, that's the force.
Oh yeah, I love the way you're putting that, Luke, that a beaver has an embodied environment. You know, if you look at...
We too, as human beings, as individuals, we are still embodied. We add a loop to the system's evolution, but we are also more or less the representatives of a next order dynamic which is going on. And that's where the wars are created.
What is interesting in doing my research for the American Revolution and looking at the Scottish Enlightenment, I had to trace from the Isle of Iona, where Irish Catholicism had its base, and it spread across overcoming the Celtic cultures. And in traditional Celtic culture, the king had to put his feet in a stone granite world that had been chiseled out, so his feet were embodied, and so he was connected to the land and the people. The first thing the Christian church did was do away with that, because it was a sky god, it was an abstract, it was word-based system.
But we decapitated the king in 1789. That was a major decision, and we replaced it with a system of codes, parliament.
Oh yeah.
Leave the body behind too.
What was interesting in the evolution of the American approach to revolution was the Amsterdam, the Netherlands use of perspective in your painting. Mm-hmm. Using the lens, then influenced, because Scotland and the Netherlands were great trade partners against the English. And that idea of perspective, where the priest was not as big as the church, there was no perspective, it was an iconographics thing. But the idea of interaction and perspective as it changed. So the girl with the pearl earring, you can see everything in interrelationship. And that's what Bateson was talking about, is I don't live in a world of things. I live in a world of relationships. And that's what the Dutch taught the Scots that then influenced them when they started dissecting bodies in Edinburgh. Because all of a sudden the revelation is the body is a regulatory system, not a bunch of hydraulics or humors or whatever else things. And that regulation of the body and its complexity, as you saw in that picture of the cell, was the model that became the body politic for the American Second Revolution of James Madison, the Constitution, and the framework of government. So they were able to penetrate down to the living system level to be able to design a system that would help prevent. And
So
how
I would go further than Bates, and I would say it is not a system of relations, it's a system of expectations. And the expectations are no longer necessarily embodied all the time. And therefore, they can operate against time. So they're not historical.
I love your use of expectations. We'll hopefully have Judith Rosen giving a presentation here coming up soon. She's the daughter of Dr. Rosen, and his whole thing is expectation systems.
Yes.
He calls it anticipatory systems. But his whole model was the model of the individual and the model of the environment. What I'm trying to do is saying that's exactly correct, but you need to be looking at the layering on top going through time, because the truth function that and the ethics that cybernetics could provide is looking at the truth and consequence. When I'm able to understand the patterns of thinking of a time frame, I'm able to not only look at the supply chain of ideas and the constellation of the ideosphere, but its consequence of that pattern over time. The way Madison, Jefferson, and others were taught to read history was from Gibbon's Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire, that said it's about patterns. Patterns, have consequence. How you design your legal system has consequence. That was an important distinction.
I would like to interject here, if I could, please.
Please.
I think Lute has a very important point to make there, between the difference between the relationships as in terms of present tense or past tense that are endured over cultural periods, and the expectations of the coming periods. But these two are not independent of one another by any means. They are tightly coupled. And while I agree that the expectations are not necessarily embodied, if they will become embodied if history goes that way. So I think this is a crucial issue that is very germane to the problem. I guess the second point is, given what is embodied at present in the government or the culture or the current news, how do you become creative with images for those expectations of the future, and how do you spread those images of expectations in a direction that you wish your vector to point?
Lowell, I'd like to just say something at a very basic level.
Sure.
That's possible. I'm not an academic by any manner of means, but I most certainly don't apologize for that. I am just who I am. I've kind of wandered around the place, around Africa, Middle East and beyond, and worked with many different specialist groups and various government agencies, etc., over a long period of time. And to me, there is one profound major problem, and that is a huge lack of understanding. A lack of understanding of what it is like at grassroots, on the ground, especially in areas of Africa and the Middle East. We have created political borders, geographic borders, but native tribes, that doesn't mean anything to them. We don't understand, or there is a lack of understanding of what it actually is like to live in a place like Lascori in Somalia, and to understand how the tribal influences work today. We created the colonial implication, and we have a commercial implication. But then we look at the political side. And the problems I've seen the political side is whether not making any comment about who's in power. But politics tend to have short sight. They are doing policies for 1, 2, 3 years. So now what you have is a lack of understanding of what's actually at the grassroots and what feeds the cause and what feeds the problem. And then at the top level, people who really were very bright, very intelligent, but their actual programming is for a very short space of time. And all that happens is that we make the problems worse because we never actually address the real problem. And we see it through our eyes. One of the big problems, we put people into the field and we tell them to look for things and to listen for things. But they already interpret it in terms of how they are. They don't actually just listen to hear and see to see, and let the picture and the sound paint the picture and tell the story. I don't know what to do about it. Lowell and I have worked in some programs together, but trying to persuade people to think in a different way on a long-term basis is extremely difficult. Equally, it's very difficult, and I don't know any of you, well, I obviously have heard of you, Terry Waite, but I don't know any of you really. I know that from working with Lowell and what Lowell states and has written documents for me to pass on to people, often the first page is read, but because it's in detail, it's in depth, it never gets to the reader at any level where they should actually understand it. And I see the problem of how do we make a statement that can be read and understood right across the board where it needs to be understood. I've often spoken with people who go in and they say, we have awareness of what's going on in Chad. We have awareness of what's going on in Niger. We have an awareness of what's going on in Somalia. They might have awareness, but they don't have understanding. And to me, that's a major problem, followed up by the problem like I have. I don't know how to discuss, how to talk my little bit of understanding in a way that transcends to both the academic and the political side. So it's a very complex situation.
In part, that is a function of the arts. I think Lowell answered part of your question by telling stories.
Yeah.
And stories, the stories he told, threw considerable light upon the basis of his argument. And I think in this whole complex mixture, the arts have a vital interpretive role to play.
But again, the stories is absolutely correct, because if you go back to the native cultures, they all pass on the knowledge through stories. Now, those stories may be written, they may be vocal, may be painting, but it's a way of transferring information from one period to another. But for people to learn from that, they have to have the time to understand it. And where I see the problem is that in governance just now, there is no interest in time, because the very act of being in governance is short term, whether it's short term on a political basis or short term in the commercial field. It doesn't easily allow for long-term answers.
An example, one of the programs I worked on with the British Council. The British Council is one of the most brilliant things that the UK ever created. We worked with the Tricycle Theatre in London.
Oh, yeah.
And they had 9 playwrights create 3 plays called The Great Game. It was about the whole history of Afghanistan, of how they kicked out the British, how they kicked out the Russians, and how they're kicking out the Americans. It went to Washington, then went to LA, Houston, and Chicago. And then we brought it back again because we didn't get enough generals there at the first time. When we did, it was fascinating watching. Now, I'm sure you people working with the military folks daily understand how a general walks down a red carpet, even if there is no red carpet, with a military brass blaring. They were walking into these theater, understanding the whole history of warfare and its fated logic. And when they walked out, they all had their hands like this. They didn't walk the same way. But it was too late. You know, this was after the Afghan war had been going on for X years. This was in the 2006 time. That sort of arts, you know, in the storytelling. One of the things that we've been discussing in this Club of Remy has been creation of a club of a Horizons College, a postgraduate that would have military, government, industry, academics dealing with complexity. When I was at Stanford Research Institute, we used to do a lot of projects with the Office of Technology Assessment that was created by Congress to help Congress think about the complexity of these new information technologies, these new technologies coming along, and how they could properly regulate, inform, encourage, etc. The Republicans, of course, killed it and say, well, our lobbyists can give us the same information. We know how that ends. But if we did a Horizons College as a finishing school for people that are trained, like what Glenn trained in terms of language, etc. You know, the people that I've dealt with that went over to Iraq as quote reporters, they were from Tennessee peacemakers. This guy who's 95 now, had spent 50 years in the Middle East. He said all these translators, they translate the words, but they don't translate the meaning. They would go into a town that on the map would be Shia, and you look around, you knew it was Sunni, but no one could tell the difference. That sort of lack of perception, and what I'm trying to say is, it's not just the perception, it's the proception of our cultural snail world, from the Treaty of Westphalia to the Treaty of Versailles, etc., all embodying a type of logic that we don't understand and the consequences of.
If I may interject, Lowell's first slide actually gives a little clue, Hamish, I guess, to connect the academic with the practical. So in the first slide, he has the big circle of logic, and logic is actually the art of making distinctions. And so the way I understand it, every story comes with a set of distinctions, and every culture has their base distinctions. So there is a whole complexity of distinctions. And one could also say there are gestalts, like shapes, structures, that captures those distinctions. And I heard you mention the importance of listening. And so the way that I understand our problem today is that we are in academy trivializing this importance of gestalts, and instead there is a tendency to talk in zeros and ones and to think it's all about the computer, and and whether computers need to be treated as human beings. And so it's literally kind of, the pendulum is a little bit in the wrong direction. And that can be actually traced back to the European philosophy of Descartes and Immanuel Kant, because if you see how they define knowledge, they actually think it's already inside the head, while, as you point out, knowledge is created in the discursive activities of listening, the most important one, but also how we talk, and now what we do when we read and when we write. And cybernetics, I think, is really pointing out that there is all sorts of interactions taking place. And so whether we as academics reflect on those interactions, or whether we kind of remain stuck in our in whatever worldview we learned as a PhD student. So I would go back to the art of making distinctions and the flexibility of picking up on distinctions. And that then, and that's my last comment, that brings us gestalt shifting. Because I think what Laura was talking about is that you come somewhere and you have an ability to feel the gestalt of the culture and to engage with it. And then the question is, how do you learn that? How does one acquire that skill?
I once, if I may say so, just this may sound very, very simple and very naive, but I once used an illustration that I think touches on part of what is being said. That primitive man walked barefooted and was in touch with the earth. The next step was to put on shoes. And the third step was to cover the earth with concrete. And by saying that, gradually, as so-called civilization has progressed, we've divorced ourselves from the environment, of which we are an essential part. And we've used it and raped it. And in all sorts of ways, which has alienated us in many ways from ourselves, from our environment, and from each other.
Yes.
In the history of Scotland, people, historians, that looked at that transition of Christianity, one of the first things they did was set up the model for kings, which was because there were internecine wars every time a king would die. They created the concept of legitimacy through heredity and the divine right of kings, which became a model for Europe. But their description of what happened as you move from the king putting his feet in the granite to the aerial god, the word god, was ecological desecration. It was separation from the ecology of the environment. Whereas if you look at the artifacts of the Celtic world, it's all intertwined and interrelated and interactive.
There's no way back.
Is there no way back?
No.
What is the way forward?
Expectation.
Yeah, that's difficult. That's a very difficult issue. But there's no way back. We can say we are alienated from the environment, but we cannot go back and be not alienated from the environment.
Right.
I think we could learn from the past, because I know that the first time I went into Yemen and into Somalia well, a long time ago, I found it very difficult to begin to understand the things in the different little villages and the interrelationship of tribes and sub-tribes. But I came from a small town, from an area where there was a lot of fishing. And between the 3 towns, 4 towns, maybe 12, 14 miles apart, each one had its own way of doing things and its own kingpins and who ran what. And all I did was think, well, I'll think back to the time of the clans in Scotland and how families were in subcultures. And it's exactly the same. And it's the same whether in the last couple of years being in North Africa, then we have the history to understand, because we all have in Scotland, not that distant history, the same processes, but we have to make the effort to understand how that works and how the loyalties go so far, and how loyalties in two major clans run all the way from Kenya through Somalia, through Oman, all the way to the Middle East, right into the lower Iran. And clan loyalty is very important, and it often goes over the top of what we may consider right and wrong. And we do have knowledge of it, but we have to make other people. I've sat in meetings with very high profile people, giving them, let's say, a local awareness. And I've been categorically told it can't be like that, because our knowledge, our information is, and then you say, well, where do you get your information? Well, we get our information from people we have sent in to see what the situation is. It's an imbalance. And I know I don't have the answers,
Hello.
but a little bit of experience.
Hello, I'm just on a conference call. Can you, is there something urgent?
Right, there he is, a call.
Oh, he should turn down his microphone.
Sorry, I couldn't hear you.
So if there's no way back, then the only way forward is theory. Theorizing and getting better theories. So in the case of Afghanistan and Iraq, we have to develop, we have to hope that anthropologists can develop theories which are relevant to accessing that problems, specifying the problems. So if you take your fishing problem in Scotland, there will be industrial fishing as it is in Norway.
Yeah, I'm thinking about John Domenico Pico when he was confronting the terrorists that held the American-British hostages. The first thing that the terrorists said to him, being surrounded by folks with AK-47s, was, these are not your people. You know, why are you doing this? You're, you know, implying that you're Catholic, you know, you're Italian. Why are you doing this? And what he said next came from the fact, like what Hamish mentioned. He came from where three countries converged. A communist was his best friend, even though a communist had killed his grandfather. You know, he was able to look at the differences and put together the hologram. So his response was, I want to pay it forward. He says, what the hell does that mean, pay it forward? And the guys are, you know, sitting there. And of course, his comment is, when you're a diplomat of hostages, like your mother always said, you have to have clean underwear because the first thing they'll do is strip you. So he's stripped naked in front of these guys. His life is on the line of how he makes the next answer. Instead of getting out of the stimulus response of the question, he goes to another level. He says, in the future, when my son meets your son, I do not want it to be at the end of a gun. You know, I want it to be trading wheat, grain, whatever else. Now, of course, this terrorist was the most notorious terrorist at that time, killed. His son was killed too. Gianni's son is still alive. But that idea of all of a sudden I created a link to a person across the bridge of cultures and clans and ideas and all those images of being the bad guy. And what was fascinating about the story that Gianni said was the terrorist said, I know it's wrong to kidnap people and kill them. I know it's wrong. We have no other option. So understanding how expectations that you use, Lute, or anticipation, as a Rosen would say, we've got to understand how that presents what we see here and ultimately react and decide and act upon.
What we see here is a special case, which happens to me.
Could I add a truism?
Please.
That cognitive processes lead to conclusions and affective processes lead to decisions.
Ooh.
Very nice.
Yes.
We need a piece on that one, Bob.
Follow up on what Bob has said, because I've been thinking similar thoughts. Listen to the discussion. Well, we can.
Could I just interrupt? Could I interrupt and just to say I'm sorry you froze at that point. I missed what you said, the truism.
Oh, sorry.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but my screen froze and I didn't hear what you said.
Always pleased to repeat myself. I said that cognitive processes lead to conclusions and affective processes lead to decisions.
Thank you.
And thinking about that in terms of when Gianni had confronted the terrorists, he moved it to the affective side versus the conclusion kill.
Exactly.
Yeah, but I would like to add in here that this, I think, is a very, from my perspective, very deep wisdom from Bob. You can tell the stories and they present the history. Is the purpose in telling the story to make a logical decision or an affective decision? It's very tricky, it seems to me, from the perspective of consciousness, of exactly when the logic ends and the affection starts. But this is what the affections control our behaviors, no matter what the logic is.
Peter, you have a comment?
Jerry, I think you're actually pointing out how the relation between logic and affective processes, or rationality and affective processes, that is totally confused in our culture, because I see logic as the art of distinctions, and it is part of making the affective decision, but it is very different from the role it would play in a rational or cognitive process. But there is a line like kill, not kill, and the affective process say not killing. And what the cognitive process say, I'm going to leave to Bob to answer.
May I ask why you separate cognitive processes into two categories? I don't understand why this is desirable.
Is this directed at me, Jerry?
Yes.
Okay, well, Jerry, I think you are doing it yourself when you say that biochemistry comes with a different logic than physics. And so I would go then a step further and say, and biology gives us a different way of thinking of logic, or cognitive processes. Sorry, I confuse the words. It goes directly to this idea of the computer as having an identity relation with the human brain. So if you believe that, yeah, there is nothing else to say. But there are a lot of academics or other people that think that identity relation, there is no reason to assume that. And they're trying to explore what happens when we assume there is no such identity relation.
But my response would be that, well, the logics that are involved in the natural sciences are put together and all seek to come to rational conclusions from whatever the antecedent premises were within that science. None of these come to affective behaviors on my part unless I make some emotional decision of this is what I will do next. And I would pick up here on the discussion of the alphabets, the symbolic alphabets that are brought together to have communications in the sense of first order cybernetics, where these symbolic communications are all put into one simple pattern for communication. We don't have that capability for our affects. We have no way to encode what our affects really are.
But I would respond to that. I agree. Our understanding of affect is very poorly, but I would like to also make a distinction between categorical logic and Boolean logic. Like this categorical logic is about, like, you have the three laws, like does it go in the container of is or is it not, and what is cannot be is not. So that is a very, I mean, that is what I think of as a way of thinking of rationality, of starting with a categorical logic. But then there is this other way of thinking in economics, that they say there is an ordered reference set, and they get to your dictionary, and the economists say, forget about categorical logic, it's all about my ordered reference set. And I think that's where the conversation kind of gets muddled, because we assume that people have this continuously disordered reference set, and that we all need to translate from one set to the other, while it's really about the gestalt, as Lowell told with this story. And so, but the point I'm trying to make is, I understood your presentation as saying that there is a different logic. There is not just one logic. There are very different ways of doing logic.
At least
And
there's a difference between...
bring other people up because we're using some academic terms here. Boolean algebra, Boolean logic, created 1854, George Boole, is the basis of all our computers. Computers, and Admiral Poindexter, as an example, when he created the all-knowing computer, showed its fragility of computers. You have to know the whole universe of U.S. telephone numbers, people, because the wholeness is within the boundary. So like in a telephone system, I dial in H-A-M and I'll get Hamish, because it knows the dictionary, the directory of names. What we're talking about is something beyond the computer, which is a wholeness of living systems that Richard Knowles talks about as the ontological level of information identity relationship. And that wholeness is not encapsulated in a computer construction of binary terms. It's powerful. God knows it's powerful, but it is not the same thing, because the wholeness is a different form of wholeness.
Well, this is Richard, when we look at information relationship and identity in terms of logic, paradigm, and model, and try to bring that into coherence from the logic down to the model, we can use the natural processes about how work actually takes place. And we can see those processes very clearly. And when we bring information, relationship, and identity together with the terms you used in your model and paradigm descriptions, we can get a sense of the whole and the parts and the interactions of the parts. So for example, going back to the story where the paradigm was shifted when the man took his clothes off and said, I want my son to be able to talk with your son. The next part of that should have been, Well, let's talk about that. Maybe we can co-create a future together where that is possible and we don't have to do what we're doing now. And so in the conversation together, we can co-create something new that none of us knew beforehand. And so we can begin to shift ourselves, I think, if I understand it, from the cognitive processes over to the affective processes and do that together, even though we're quite different, providing we're willing to talk together and to try to listen and understand and sit down together.
The power of what Richard Knowles does from his safety work and what I'm trying to customize in terms of how do you map a wholeness of a people and the way they, and the vector they're going into. If the vector is towards the fogs of war and fogs of peace, we are doing the same thing time and again. We have a repetition. The question is evolution or revolution that is based upon what Richard says is the living, self-organizing system based on how living systems operate. It has to process information. It has to be a perceptual field. I don't know how a strip of RNA and fat and a lipid and a protein can process, but it evolves as it goes from humans to minks back to humans. That evolutionary process is the wholeness, not our consciousness, not our environment, not our created environment, but something larger. So that's what we need to harness. And that's where Horizons College, or whatever we want to call it, as a finishing school for people who already have experience, like Hamish and others in the field, Terry in the field, that then can be customized as a higher level of wisdom. And that's where we hope the systems cybernetic world may be able to contribute.
What I learned from this is, I know the distinction between cognitive learning and normative learning, but that you have all the time both of them in parallel. We need both, continuously both. So the distinction is analytical.
In my experience of trying to set up a Quaker school for the past 20 years, which we have, is how do you get that experiential education that grounds in the normative, etc., the experiential and the conceptual. So as an example, in New Zealand, this woman was brought into a Maori, the indigenous people's school system. And the way she created the learning environment for these school children says, here is a shoebox on my desk. Put your word you want to find out about in here and we'll explore it. Ocean, sex, whatever it is. They put it there and were able to ground it because they had learned something about seashells or whatever it is. But then they were able to then tie that into the larger theoretical cognitive structures that allow them to navigate. We can't navigate today. Sorry, get excited.
Yes, today you are on a trajectory.
Good. Peter, you've been writing some comments there. You want to talk about them?
I find it, I find it a little hard to, because when the conversation jumps around, it's hard to jump in at the right time. But, vis-a-vis what it is that goes into our decision-making, how it is that we decide to act in one way or another, requires a psychological framework. And our decision-making can depend on our thinking, what we perceive in the immediate environment. It can depend upon our emotional state, because our emotional states can predispose us to act in a certain way or another, whether to fight or flee. It can depend on memory, if there are salient past experiences that we have had in a given situation. Our memory conditions us to react in a certain way, really independent of our thinking about the situation or our emotional reactions to it. Although memory can have both cognitive and emotional components. And it depends heavily on the goals that we have in a given situation. So there is a way of thinking about psychology in terms of what are the mental faculties and operations that lead to behavior, particular behavior in a particular situation. So that's all I want to interject. I don't think that people are only emotional beings or only cognitive beings or only pursuing, their immediate desires. These are all defeasible constraints, and they're competing with each other at any one time to dominate the behavior of our behavior as a whole. So I think that that's all I really have to say.
Thank you, Peter. My comment is, I think part of our problem is that we look at the reinforcement through psychology to individualize people and look at a behavioral construct versus what drives behavior. And it's not a Freudian hydraulic system of force against force, desires, etc. And so
I reject Freudianism. I mean, it's just not grounded in biology or in any kind of understanding of how the brain works. But I think, and there are social factors strong social factors that influence our decisions. But all of those have to go back through the individual human beings or individual animals, individual brains, should we say. And so it's not like the social is completely autonomous vis-a-vis individuals. There is a reciprocal interplay between what's going on, how individuals interpret social signals and how the social signals emerge, as a collective organization. So I reject social determinism in that way. There is an interplay between the individual and the social. And the biological substrates are all in individual brains. We don't have access to each other's consciousness. We don't have access to each other's thoughts except through this medium of communication via language and the nonverbal parts of language as well.
Peter, I would say that we do not think through our brain. We think outside our brain because you and I are talking.
We are our brains.
It's not about brain, it's about mind. And mind is
the mind is the organization of the brain.
No.
It's an organization embedded. It's an informational organization embedded in the physical structure of brains.
That is so not a truism. That is an assumption that is metaphysical. And that is precisely what is under discussion here, I believe.
Well, the working hypothesis that virtually all neuroscientists have is that any change in our experience is related to some change in the structure and organization of neural activity. And I don't know of any examples where that's not true, empirically.
I can tell you in Europe, there is a resistance coming where they start looking at gestalt and where they focus on the here and now as opposed to some fantastic story about what happened on the first day of the universe, like the Big Bang. Because after all, the materialist viewpoint is totally grounded in this idea of what happened during the Big Bang. And
wait. Just back up. We don't have to talk about the Big Bang.
We do, yeah.
I don't understand why, and what I'm saying is not a purely materialist view. It's a hylomorphic view in which our thoughts and our minds are the organization of a material system. So I'm not an eliminative materialist. I'm not a Cartesian dualist. The two are inseparable.
Our point here is we're trying to get to how do you change the system? And, you know, I came from a history of consciousness program where indeed some of our students there changed the system and the cognitive development that resulted in Black Lives Matter, that developed the program for Hezbollah in terms of feeding children, health clinics out of Oakland with Huey Newton. That is a reality. They changed consciousness. What I'm saying is there was another group there at History of Consciousness that was trying to say it's not about just looking at a new wholeness of history by getting the oppressed and others, as important as it is, into the thinking. It's about how, not just our thinking, but how our system processes information.
Well, we may be thinking, you know, we may be using the word consciousness in different senses of the word. When I use it exclusively to mean awareness. You know, the difference between our subjective experience when we're under anesthesia versus when we're waking, like right now, presumably, for all of us. And consciousness in the sense of, it sounds like, of the history of consciousness at Santa Cruz is the contents of our minds, you know, how we think. And those are good things to change people's minds in positive ways. I'm not at all against that, but you know, if we were talking about two things, we just need to be clear that that's what we're talking about. That the two sets of concepts aren't.
So let's hear from some other people here.
But very, very quickly, I want to say, Peter, I agree with you. We're comparing two different models. And there is no way to say that one model is like more true than the other. They're just different.
It's not
what I'm trying to say in our presentation here is the model, the paradigm, and the logic create a pattern that over time can be determined by a truth function of its results and consequences. If you look at the results and consequences of the Treaty of Versailles versus the results and consequences of the Atlantic Treaty, you see totally different outcomes. So it's a matter of introducing time into understanding the development of a pattern. And so what we're trying to do here in Cybernetic is create the patterns that result in more healthy systems versus collapsing systems.
Good.
Gary, comment? Gary?
But all I was going to say, I'm afraid at 5 o'clock I have an appointment. I have to go.
Yeah, we'll be concluding in a couple. We'll be concluding in a couple of minutes here. Yeah, because we try to limit it to 2 hours, and we then set up, you know, for our next meetings, etc. We haven't heard from Stuart Umpleby if he's still online. Anyone else that wishes to speak?
Okay, this is Stuart Umpleby. I'll just say something briefly. I always enjoy listening to Lowell speak because of his background in this history of consciousness program and his view of history as a series of conceptualizations. So just to recapitulate, I really like his example of how World War I was fought in the context of a conceptualization of colonialism. And the war ended with a continuation of or a modification of the colonial system. But then the Atlantic Charter that I think it was Churchill and Roosevelt, well, Churchill, no, excuse me, I think it was Roosevelt's idea, and Churchill reluctantly went along with it, was where the US said, we'll help you get out of this war, but you have to give up your colonies, or be willing to over time to give up the colonies. And that's a change of the conceptual system to autonomous independent nation states. So I just find all that extremely interesting, that history is in a sense a series of conceptualizations and legal systems. And so I always find it valuable to listen to Lowell. Thank you.
Glenn, do you have any comments? You haven't spoken yet. You have to take off your mic. Hello.
There. Lowell, I always learn so much when I spend an hour or two with you. And I appreciate that. And I appreciate the input from all the rest of them. But now I have to go and think about it. And I'm at that wonderful age of 91 years where I don't necessarily want to think anymore. But I'm delighted. Thank you so much for inviting me to join you.
Well, this is a process. These are developing the questions, not the final answers. It's by our continuing dialogue over the weeks, each Wednesday, that we try to bring up new topics and approach social change and transformation with these tools of systems. Because what we have is an asymmetric system of the cybernetic concepts of feedback, circuitry, organization, overpowering our culture, as in social media, as in thinking that drones will solve a war. And it's asymmetric, and it's exactly what Gregory Bateson predicted about the atom bomb being asymmetric, and that you have to gain intelligence about other sides, otherwise one side will push the button because it believes its own fog of information. And so what we're doing now is trying to say the founders, Bateson, Wiener, etc., Heinz von Forster, of cybernetics that created these biological computer laboratories and computers were then given by a $2.5 trillion research budget from 1959 to make it real in our pocketbooks in our Zoom conference. It's an asymmetric system where our human natural intelligence is suffering. How do we empower the structuring of our own natural intelligence? I think Richard Lowell has some solutions. I think Hamish, with his experiential basis, has some solutions. And I'm always welcoming Bob Kinsley's wisdom and comments. He says things so succinctly. So,
well, I have a question. What do you see this work leading to? Are you writing a book, or are you preparing to do a movie? And for what audience? Well, what's in your mind?
Two responses. One is I'm writing a book on the American Revolution called Uncommon Sense, The Making of the American Experiment, where I looked at how they went against the Western tradition and how rebellious these ideas are, because what the American thinkers were doing was using systems and cybernetics in the 1770s. And if you can see that in the term problemique and its usage, it starts in 1708, it goes up radically in the 1700s, and then goes down by the 1720s in creating the American Revolution. It then flatlines until 1945. And a problem versus a problemique is its massive wholeness of interrelationships.
Do you have a target?
I'm trying to get back to write the book on that. In terms of the film, we're trying to get either a feature film or a documentary on John Domenico Pico and how he basically was a man without a gun, was able to change systems. So we're trying to get the dialogue about how do systems change when you think differently.
So the book, who will be the target audience of the book? I mean, the target readers. It's more towards the side of public nonfiction reading, or to more towards to a policy report or policy suggestions.
The former, if I'm successful, it will be more of a popular book. But when you start getting into the science behind the natural science and natural philosophy behind the American Revolution, you start getting to the complexity of what we're talking about today. So I don't know whether that's just a subsection appendix or something, but the audience should be the public, because that's what we need a discussion on today.
Yeah, involves term. You're helping people. You're trying to help people to reach to conclusion, or to help them to make a decision. I mean,
both
which
Decision to
side?
buy the book, yeah.
Any other questions? Because we want to conclude by 12 so people can leave.
Can I just throw in one last story, very quick, which I think has something to say to some of the earlier points. Many years ago, when I was negotiating face-to-face with Gaddafi for the release of hostages, I met him in his tent in Libya. And at our first meeting, I presented him with a book of 6th century Islamic philosophy, which he was amazed to receive, very grateful to receive. And that set the basis for the possibility of having quite an interesting dialogue with him, which eventually resulted in the release without payment, without any other payment at all, of the hostages that were being held in Libya. It may have some bearing on some of the things that have been said today.
Absolutely, it does. So thank you. So we have things to think about. And hopefully, Glenn, you'll get a good nap, and then we can think some more together. Well, thank you all. This meeting has been recorded. We'll be putting it up sometime on the channel as a ability for us to refer on where we've been and where we need to go.